Greetings, Mark Gardens here, reporting in for this Wednesday day. How's everybody doing? I'm a little slow today. This is actually already supposed to be pre-recorded, but I pushed back. I basically am changing my schedule a little bit, so now more or less, you know, the content will continue to happen. It just may happen a little later than expected. That's all. And with that said, today's topic is going to revolve around things relative to the contemporary period. And with that said, I will be going into dependency. Now, what I mean by dependency is the essentially the concept of you know being a cause and effect situation, right? Basically, being in relation to other people, right? Basically, you being a an effect of somebody else's cause or the cause of somebody else's effect. Either or is just basically your participation in a cycle or a any type of connective relationship in general, right? And you have to take into consideration this is not nothing new. People have always been a factor in other people's lives. It's just a matter of how and why. And I feel like in today's period, that's more important now than it is ever, because it's people being a factor in other people's lives is definitely a relevant topic today, because it's why the world is the way it is, and it's why the world is going in the direction that it is going, and it is why the world is essentially built with the rules that it is built, right? Because it's the idea that you're not only worried about you yourself, you're worried about you know you're worried about other people as well, because the idea is that other people, by worrying about other people, you worry about yourself. And I'm not going to argue with this. I'm not going to agree or disagree with that concept, but you should know that that concept is the very basis upon which most governments relate to each other today. Um, what I'm going to basically focus on with dependency is people to people, cause and effect, right? Because it's so easy to look at the broad aspects versus the close, the short, not the short term, the close aspects. What you know, for the most part, a person to person relationship is never anything too serious, right? But for the when you're talking about a community, right? A developing community, the person to person relationship at times has a tendency of being taken out of his comfort zone and then being too comfortable, right? And how it be too comfortable, basically assume certain things, assume certain feelings, which makes things too comfortable. Or you hate it when people try to include you in things, and you be like, that's not really how I feel, but then you be like, bump it, I might as well, right? And I feel like that's just how it works. Um 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 and what you get from these type of things is basically like the difference between a safe environment or a not so safe environment. Like, people tend to characterize the urban environment is not so safe, whereas you know no other place can do wrong, right? And that's just a cause and effect relationship, right? the idea that in a city with a lot of people, you have a tendency of feeling like your safety is a concern, because the chances of you walking outside and recognizing somebody are probably next to none if you travel to the city versus live in the city, right? And even if you live in the city, your chances of recognizing somebody that you know is still not that good, because the city is to your advantage to basically navigate at your own prerogative, right? Meaning, they say that publicity is never a bad thing, but I feel like publicity is always a liability, because by definition, your ability to relate to others is going to be a factor as to how well you are able to get along. And if you make it hard for people to relate to you, then you can expect that it's going to have a negative impact on your ability to relate to people. And what that means then is that when you get the dependency thing, right? The idea that your ability to basically influence other people or convince people to influence you is going to be affected by this, right? You know, it makes a difference between someone being a convincing argument who wants to be a friend and who doesn't want to be a friend, right? It makes the convincing argument between someone who says they need help and someone who says they don't need help. It makes the convincing argument between someone who says that they are a basically a member of society versus not a member of society, right? And I feel like back in the day, being a member of society wasn't too hard. You know what I mean? You could come outside and basically participate, right? Nowadays, I feel like participation is more so a different rule game, because the contemporary period has focused more so on interpersonal relationships versus the broader concept, right? Meaning it's much more important nowadays to know who you know, like by name, and who you can point to and acknowledge versus um who do you see as your neighbor and all of that other stuff. Because once you know your neighbors, back in the day, you was pretty much set. There was nothing that could be said, because you already know who your neighbors are. So all you had to do was basically be like, oh, that's him, or that's her, and everything was set. Nowadays, knowing your neighbors is not enough. Nowadays, it is more so about are you a neighborhood versus a neighbor, right? And the idea is that you, when you look at a world where identification, right? Identification becomes more and more important as the world becomes more and more populated, right? So your dependency changes, right? Instead of just being able to be associated into a group, your association has now been upgraded into identification in a group, right? And that then means that you have to basically be you basically have to be more than just a face, right? You have to be a name and a face, as well as a character that somebody can attest to, right? And even then, you are expected to uphold all these forms of identification at any convenient point, because if you don't, then it makes it that much more easy to scrutinize your position, right? Um, uh, 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 and I only say this as a person who has basically been born and watched the times change, right? A point where you went from the transition. I basically was born into the transition from the tube TV to the plasma, from the radio phone to the computer phone, from uh, uh, the cable to the wireless. All of these transitions happening all at once, and basically bringing with them the dependency that, when I was a kid, I didn't have to worry about, right? Because I feel like most people in my age group, they actually in my age group and beyond, you know, you basically had to just worry about, who your family was. You didn't have to worry about who didn't like you because it was never that important. And, it was pretty much set. But nowadays, who doesn't like you is so much more important now, right? It literally becomes a matter of friends and enemies, right? And it's kind of crazy, right, to think that you live in a world where knowing your enemies is much more important than it should be. But apparently, that's just how the times change. You have to know your enemies. You have to know your friends. And um, the funny thing is, these roles are not liable to stick, right? The idea is that, at any time your enemies could change their identity to their friends, or your friends could change their identity to your enemies, and these fluid roles are not they're not basically that is not a option for you, right? At some point or another, your identification in society becomes rigid, right? And that makes a difference between adults and kids, right? So, that's just a hmm, one of the obvious changes, right? One of the obvious examples. A not so obvious example simply is the role the role of the friend, right? Nowadays, the role of the friend can carry you much farther than it used to be able to carry you, right? The idea is that more friends is better than less friends, right? And you say this because, in a world where your identification or your character is important, you know, it's just um a thing to know, right? The idea that you can basically navigate on easy street, provided that you have people that will allow you to do this, right? And I feel like it's always been like that to a certain degree. It's just that your relation and dependency on it is much more the extreme is much more valuable now, right? The idea is that if you really are a true to death politician, right, and you can figure out a system of stepping stone people, right, that it can essentially carry you a lot farther than you could carry yourself, basically being a old fashioned type of person, right? The idea that what you don't make with your own hands, you don't want, right? And that's saying a lot because it basically means that you can figure out what is the attitude of the day, right? And the attitude of the day, more or less, is that there is safety in numbers. That's always been apparent. I mean, by definition, that's how the city was born. But when you see how it is able to take a modern context, you have to appreciate how certain things will never change no matter how you No matter how much technology you surround yourself with, there will always be um those extinct those extinct instinct there we go instinct realities, right? Um and what it means then is that you have a choice, right? You can basically you can try to uphold the old, right? But the problem is that when you are working at a disadvantage, it becomes more like you're peer pressuring yourself, right? Versus the other way, most people they tend to characterize peer pressure as people um encouraging and discouraging you, but you would never think that you yourself could peer pressure yourself to not be um with peers, right? And that's basically what that happens. What happens, right? It basically becomes characterized as you discouraging yourself from being social, yada yada yada. But in reality, on the other end, you don't want to be seen as a follower neither, right? And that's I feel like that's a weakness of the role, right? The idea that if friends can do so much for me, why is nobody basically harping on the idea of the follower leader relationship anymore? And I feel like that's just a that's a give and take relationship, right? And my perspective on that is that people will always take, but people won't always give. So I'm always worried when people try to encourage, basically, accepting everybody and all of that other stuff. Because if you put too many hands, if too many hands want to come out instead of you know put in, then the group itself is going to be useless, right? It's going to be more or less held back by the ironically by its numbers, right? You would think that a group can only get stronger by its numbers, but it can definitely be held back by its numbers because if the moment a group decides that it doesn't want any one member, right? It then becomes the group mentality gives into pettiness, right? The idea that you basically said that the group was a loose conglomerate, right? There was no real qualifications, and then when you turn around and say there are qualifications, then you like, this is stupid, right? And I feel like that's always been a weakness of this whole strategy, right? The idea that if you're um if you basically recruit people off of a friendliness, right? The idea that anybody's welcome, and then when you turn around and realize that that's not really true, you end up conceding that point. The idea that you don't use people, then you tend to make the group look like it is a waste of time, right? And I feel like that's a weakness of the contemporary dependency thing, right? The idea that you shouldn't encourage people to be uh 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 freeloaders just to get them to participate, and then when they actually do participate as freeloaders, you are basically you basically use that as a condition of separation, right? The idea that you can't just come into a group and just take off all the people. But that's the only reason why I even bother to you know what I mean? Like it's like if somebody invited you to be a kid, right? And then when you get into the when you once you are a once you get in, right? well, not end, but once you do what you need to do to get into the group, they switch it up and be like, okay, now you got to be an adult. But I'm like, if you would have told me that at the beginning, then I would have just said no, right? And that's just, I feel like that's a common habit of today, right? The idea that um your dependency on a group will always be a liability, right? Basically, if the group wants you, it's not the same thing as the group needing you, right? And if the group doesn't need you, then what's the point of the group, right? And you know how that figures out will determine a lot, because all too much you can find people who feel like everybody needs them, right? You know what I mean? And those are the easiest suckers, because they basically get looped into any and everything in theory, right? But then when you realize that these people who feel like everybody needs them tend to be more suspicious than the people who don't care about people needing them, then it's like, excuse me, yeah, it's like, you know, um, that's just a funny thing to know, right? But focusing more so on the actual purpose, right? Um, Dependency seems more or less like a means to an end, right? The idea that a group will have something you want, but you may not necessarily have something the group wants, right? And how you balance the situation is very picky, because if I have joined the group off of the idea of what I want, right, and then I found myself more or less doing what the group wants versus what I want, then there was no point to the group in the first place. And yet we found ourselves, you know, it's so easy to go blind, right? Because initially, at some point or another, a group had to cater to individual interests, right? Because that's the premise of starting a group. You have to appeal to people's interests in order to get people to align with your cause, right? So when you stop aligning people with their cause, then your group more or less becomes a pyramid scheme, right? And this pyramid scheme is built on dependency, because like I said before, people are resources, and as resources, people will always bring to the table a minimum amount, right? And this minimum amount can easily be added up, right, into a large amount depending on the group size. And that can attract people on an individual basis, right? The idea that a group has a lot to offer to somebody who's individual but not the other way, and that relationship is crazy. And what that takes us into then is a period in which there will be a lot of changes, a lot of changes as a result of this concept, because the idea is that the group will more or less find itself in danger of disband being the reason of its own disbandment, right? The idea that whenever you have a conglomerate of people, they are not glued together. They are more or less a house of cards. And even though there was only one card at the top, right? that car is no more or less important than any of the other cars, because you have to understand that that's the basis of the loose association, right? So what happens then is that when it becomes popularized to form loose groups, right? You find yourself more or less dealing with a constant relevancy issue, right? The idea that what is this group even in place for in the first place, right? And what happens then is that you get a sort of lost, basically like a lost a lost child type of thing going on, right? Where people are basically doing things but not for any particular end, and that's usually the easiest way for a group to disband. When you basically aren't moved, it's like wandering. Basically, when you have a group of people wandering, it becomes easy for people to drift off, right? So that's the thing I worry about. The idea that people devote a lot of energy to stuff and then end up just throwing it all away anyway, right? And it's not something I should myself worry about, but since the youth will only be able to grow up in essentially dependency relationships, right? By definition, I think it's more so important for them to always understand what they get themselves into, right? Because it can be easy to say that you are a part of something, but when you know when you find that being a part of something is all it needs to be a danger to you, then I feel like you should really reconsider that, because taking into consideration the losses, right? There is a such thing as an accomplice, right? And by definition, accomplice doesn't have to do anything but be a witness, right? And this is a important thing to think about, right? The idea that you don't when people find themselves under the spotlight, they tend to think that they have to be doing something in order to basically be liable. And what this then means is that um 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 you tend to trick yourself, right? Because then you forget that you're in society, and society doesn't deal with individuals; they deal with groups. So you've already tricked your mind into thinking, my group association doesn't apply to the situation, but it always does. It always will. And that's just a something to think about when you're talking about making groups. Well, not making groups, but putting yourself in situations, right? Because making groups doesn't mean anything until a situation occurs, right? So when you put yourself in situations and thinking, oh, I'm just gonna stand here and yada yada yada, that's stupid. Because you don't know what's going on. You don't want to know what's going on, because truthfully, trouble can find you faster than you can find trouble. Always. Always, always, always. No matter how old you are, trouble can easily find you before you find it, right? And I feel like the youth don't understand this. They'll never understand this until it happens to them. And I don't want it to happen to them, because they're not breathing to their mind the idea that friends or enemies and all this other stuff. It's not even that serious. It's just a matter of you know, always try to associate yourself with the positive, right? Because this is the idea behind it. If you associating yourself with something can at any time hurt you or help you, right? You should always try to associate yourself with stuff that will help you, right? Because the idea is that at the worst, if you are associating yourself with a positive situation, all you can do is get kicked out of it, right? Whereas if you associate yourself with something that's harmful, that can only harm you, right? Worst case scenario, who knows what could happen, right? You know, that's just a easy situation analysis, right? The idea that when I place myself in situations, when you place yourself in situations, right, you should always be aware of the cost analysis, right? And if the cost is too much, even if you have to use ridiculous variables, you should still consider that, because at any time the worst can happen, right? That's that's a lesson of life, right? It's like when a rainstorm happens in the middle of the day, or a snowstorm, or you know natural disasters and all of that other stuff. It's like the worst can happen at any time, right? So you should never pretend like it can't, because just because it doesn't happen a lot doesn't mean it can't happen. You know what I mean? The the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence, right? I know you probably heard that before. And it's true. It does, just because something hasn't happened doesn't mean it can't happen. You know what I mean? And I feel like that's a lesson that most youth will never be able to relate to, because the whole idea of dependency is that the first thing you have to cater to is everybody's interest for safety, right? And it can, I can say it's easy, but it's really not, because I feel like people will always have a certain eye for harmful situations, but depending on who they are associated with, they can easily fool themselves and cast a blind eye to their own actions, and that's where you lose, right? The idea when you basically start cutting off your own danger to yourself, basically. um, Dependency, though, it's important to know, because it definitely determines a person, right? It makes a difference between somebody who helps people versus hurts people, right? And you can never it's probably easy to think of a relationship in where people help people, but I can tell you it's definitely lucrative to hurt people, right? And the reason why it's lucrative is because people are so essentially seduced by their own safety, right? The idea that it's not it's not probable for things to happen to me. So this can make you a easy sucker, right? To somebody who can bring trouble, because they already know that you anticipate things to work out in your favor. But in reality, this is real life, and like I said, tornadoes happen, tidal waves happen, thunderstorms happen, anything can happen. It's just a matter of will it happen to you, right? And I hate bringing home the point, the idea that uh, you should be wary. But I mean, it's true, man. It's true. It really is true. Uh, you know, that's just an encouragement versus a warning, right? Because a warning will always carry with it that hint of danger, right? The idea that I could be talking to you, right? Whereas an encouragement is more or less an advisor, right? I mean, I don't have to tell you, but I'll tell you. Why not? um, and you should also focus more or less on how you influence other people, right? Because you don't necessarily have to have leverage over a person in order to influence them. You can more or less be an asset to a person. It may not be, you may not be a valuable asset, but you could still be an asset to a person in which they will directly determine how they relate to you, right? Depending on that perspective. And understanding how other people see you is important to your dependency, because once you become aware that people see you in a certain way, you can conduct yourself in a better way, right? Also, how you do conduct yourself will carry on to how you influence other people one day, right? Because the idea is that, okay, you are everybody is a growing asset, right? Because it's to be assumed at some point that you want to make yourself a better person, right? You want to be a contribution. How you accomplish this is a unspoken process, an unwritten process, right? Because everybody is different. Nevertheless, it's always important to keep everybody under the same note, right? That you don't have to do it today, you don't have to do it tomorrow, but when you do it, you should do it right. And this is it just makes this makes life terribly predictable, right? Because you don't like to meet people with the impression that you're meeting a person, right? It's a lot better to meet a person with the impression that anything can happen, right? And as such, you should always keep that mind open that way, so that you yourself do not develop habits where you find yourself trying to manipulate, or you find yourself trying to coerce, or you find yourself trying to deceive people, where you find yourself trying to just do all types of naughty stuff, man, naughty stuff. And that's easier said than done, because people can also trick you, right? You never thought, you probably never really thought this, but if somebody allows you, right, to deceive them or manipulate them or something like that, you never thought that could be used against you, right? The idea that if you get that that uh that influence that you want, right? That negative influence that you want for free, what's the worst that can happen, right? And I feel like that's the reason why a lot of people go astray, is because you at some point get a situation where you are allowed to manipulate, and once you do that, your whole dependency relationships change, right? Now you are able to, you basically looking at everybody as variables, right? And all of these variables come back to whoever you're manipulating, because you have to make sure that the person that you're manipulating doesn't catch on. Even though by definition, they probably already know what's going on. They just want to see what you're doing about it. Um, and I feel like that's how a lot of people sober up, because it can be easy, it can be quick to think things, right? Not so quick to rethink things, right? And what that means is that if I feel like I got the advantage, right? Why would I you know replace a good feeling with a bad feeling, right? And be like, I don't think this is gonna work out for me. You know what I mean? And that's just another dependency, right? We tend to think of dependency as a high to low relationship, right? The idea that it's you usually gotta have something going for yourself in order to keep people under you. It's never that simple, because dependency by definition is a neutral thing, right? How you make it positive or negative is dependent on you. And we tend to trick ourselves with our own impression of negative and positive, right? Most people tend to, I feel like all people really tend to consider their actions as plausible. At any time, they tend to consider their actions as you know um justified, right? And this becomes easily twistable when you're talking about actions that you commit, and then it becomes just as twistable when you're talking about actions committed against you, right? Because the idea is that my people have a tendency of thinking that their word is law, right? And this is where you get a lot of false dependencies, right? The idea that um you have you got your own little rule book that the world has to follow. And I feel like that's how people essentially trick themselves, right? And it becomes worse when people feed into it, right? This, and I feel like this happens to males and females. I don't want to sound like I'm focusing on one gender here. Um uh 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 um um and this basically is what happens, right? You form this logic, right? This dependency logic, right? And then you act it upon people, right? And then depending on how people act, it will either force you to think or to rethink, right? Most times people won't rethink, they'll just think, right? And this is how you get these conflicts. The whole idea that you are directly interfering with a person's rule set, how they have determined to run things. And for the average person, that's all it takes to make them go off, right? And if you feel like that's how you feel, then go right ahead. But I mean, like, when you see people become prey to their own mindset, right? It it You almost feel bad for them, to be honest with you. And I don't want to see anybody do this. Even though I'm not going to stop you from doing this, I feel like it's always going to be in my interest to encourage you to fall prey to your own mindset, because the idea is that that's the only way you're going to learn, right? And if you don't learn that way, then you're hopeless. You know what I mean? It's like the timeout argument, right? If you make somebody consciously try to rethink their efforts, right? They're not going to waste that time. They're just going to basically go through the motions and keep it moving. But when you subconsciously make somebody rethink their logic, right? By forcing that human instinct to kick in again, right? Because like I said, human instinct is always formed around security, right? And I'm pretty sure everybody is has their own safety, how they basically look at how the world is, right? So, once you break that, right, you then get a your whole world, you basically your instinct kicks in and say, "Oh, pause for a second," and you kick in, and I feel like that's a lesson that every human being needs to learn, right? You need to have that pause moment and realize that, yo, I almost put my security at risk. You know what I mean? And if you don't, then you'll always have that bias, right? That you'll always look at people in a dependency relationship that is unrealistic to how the rest of the world moves, right? So what happens then is that you end up either. I feel like if a person can go the rest of their lives with a slated dependency relationship, then go right ahead, right? But for the average person, I feel like a inaccurate view will always be a harm to you, right? So for the most part, you should always be aware. But that's just this is just talk right now. People tend to think differently when they are you know um mm, mm, mm. they tend to think differently when they are in the hot seat, right? And that's not really a lesson per se. I'm not really saying anything mind breaking, but I think the point that you should get from all of this is that don't trick yourself, right? Tricking yourself is about the dumbest thing you could do in this life because you know I can give you a couple examples where tricking yourself will not help. Um, you know, hot is hot, right? Hot'll always be hot. So if I throw fire on you, it don't matter what you're thinking. Hot is hot. Um, I wouldn't recommend anybody who thinks they have wings to jump off a bridge. I wouldn't encourage anybody who thinks that they are Superman to I don't know, don't try to lift the car and throw it at me or something. That's retarded. Um, I wouldn't recommend anybody who uh if you think you're invisible, don't try to just do stuff in the broad eye. That's also pretty stupid. You can think that you blend in with the air, or that you could probably, if you could even trick your mind into thinking that you don't have a reflection, then go ahead, man, do it. But you should always be wary that the mind is a terrible thing to waste, and you do waste it by basically engaging in things that simply aren't true, right? It just represents an inaccurate drawing, depiction, right, of your relation to the world or your relation to whatever you're about to do, man. And, the sad part about it is you have to fall hard before you learn fast. um, mm, mm, mm. And with that said, to wrap up this dependency talk, I'll then close it off by basically saying, as males, it's always a a rule of thumb to be aware of how you measure stuff, right? Because if you find yourself constantly applying different things So if you find yourself constantly remeasuring what's going on, then you should probably handle that. For females, you should always take into consideration how you consider yourself an influence, right? Because it's too easy to throw the eye on what's going on externally, basically what's going on with the other person in relation to you versus what's going on with you in relation to the person, right? And you know, even though it may not result in your harm, you should always consider that you know there's more to harm than just physical measurement, right? Being a harm to yourself mentally is more dangerous than being a harm to someone physically, because mental harm can go on forever. Physical harm will always wane with time. Um, and with that said, let me show my dependency to my supporters. Shout out to Juanita Hoover, Shamir Skinner, Chris Vasquez, and my mans at the mall. Hopefully I catch him this time. We'll see. Shout out to my anonymous patrons. Everybody, I am a direct result of your positivity. I will always try to embody your positivity in my content. I will never try to contradict, and that's my thing on that. But with that said, commercial break for the next 7 to 8 minutes, and with get you a drink, get you a snack or something, and all that stuff. True, true. Word. Welcome back to this Tech Hour and the Poison Choice is Tech. Um, what we're gonna be talking about today is software and hardware. Really, I'm really I'm gonna really break it down for you because oh my god, this is like the climax of this tech talk, right? This whole software or hardware argument. And the reason why it's an argument is because there's so many ways it gets abused and watered down, and all of this stupid stuff, man. Why can't my tech just function like it was written to be function? Sorry, nah, I'm messing with you, but um, you know, it can be annoying when you see hardware struggle or when you see software just written um, um carelessly, right? And this becomes more or less an efficiency thing. When you get used to using tech, you get really pissed off when tech is not efficient because it just slows everything down and it just shows a lack of attention to detail, right? And with that said, let's break into hardware first because that's really how this all started. Now, hardware wise, the computer has been getting pieced together since uh uh the beginning of the 20th century, and that's just a heritage of the computer, right? The idea that it is a culmination of parts that it is a culmination of hardware that eventually allowed the creation of software, right? Because as we know, you know, true true primitive computers were only a bunch of light up displays, right? They weren't they weren't software in the sense of you know a a source of information that can be accessed without specific means. They were just more or less a series of circuit boards and pieces to basically help move the electricity through it, right? Um when the hardware started to really be adapted for software, then we see the advent of the computer, right? Um, you know, it wasn't the video games. Funny enough, were the tests, right? They were the patient zero for computers, because the arcade was a demonstration that the software to hardware relationship had potential, right? And the reason why it was is because basically you could you know write a code, right? And because it was able to be reproduced, it could beat out the hardware manufacturing problem, right? Because the idea is that if you had to build video games off of basically writing hardware all the time, right? The idea of a hardware board with a LCD display and an electrical source, that's pretty stiff in my opinion, because you're basically you're not even playing a video game. You're more or less playing like a lot of people today, tend to get mad at video game developers, but if you've seen what the old original, video games was like, that's not as bad. Because if I told you that if you get a circuit board, and you get and you get a screen that's connected to the circuit board, and that's your game console, a lot of people would be like, really? Really? I'm not doing this no more. I quit. You know what I mean? And that was the reality, right? That things had to change. If this industry is going to take off, you had to build software. You had to write software. You could not, rely on a screenplay and a circuit board. You had to bridge the gap, essentially, right? And the arcade started this, but that terrible bulky machine, you need like 5 men to lift that, to move that, to do anything with that. You know what I mean? That's not nobody's gonna know what the hell. I'm gonna put a freaking. We're gonna turn the. I'm gonna put the arcade in the hallway. Bump it. But like if you're in an apartment, right? Where are you going to put a arcade machine, right? You know what I mean? And the worst part about it is you can't even store more than one game in the arcade machine. You had to get for every game that you wanted, you needed that huge, big ass, like that whole, just that huge machine, right? So now you've essentially eliminated all the space in your apartment, but you have every game in the world. um, Good luck on that energy bill. Um, um, um. What then happened was, you get these attempts at breaking the hardware, the software barrier. You got the Sega Genesis, you got the Super Nintendo, you got the NES, you got all of these primitive consoles, no longer primitive computers, primitive consoles, right? And they were essentially, they were ugly, true, but technologically beautiful, magnificent, the greatest thing that's ever happened, right? And the reason why they were is because they basically show that you could bridge the gap between a screen and a hardware board, right? A circuit board, right? And that bridge could be reproduced and manufactured versus you know basically having to build a game by hand, right? You essentially was building a video game by hand. Um, the arcade you could argue the arcade was software, but in my opinion, that bulkiness just showed that it was hardware dependent. Even though it had the bridge, it had the bridge between uh uh a screen and a circuit board, but when you look at how big it is, it's like eh, nah, I'd be okay. And to put that into perspective, when you see a lot of arcade games today, which are found in console online shops, there you go. That was the genius of the software, right? The idea that you could essentially pre-package something without physical packaging, without physical, needing a physical store. You could essentially sell air. um, And how that has influenced things is that now software has become so dependent on that it is essentially holding things back now, in my opinion, because it the need for software was so that you could create a smaller system, right? Something that was actually humanly possible to carry around. And now that you've accomplished this, it needs to go back to the hardware roots, because this is what I actually learned this the other day, right? This is why I had to make this discussion later rather than sooner, because the other day I was struggling with a problem, right? See, I was trying to play this CD um and it was not being supported on any of my devices. Laptops don't exactly come naturally with disk drives, right? So I got a laptop with a disk drive, not working. I don't laptops don't have disk drives normally, so that was a special um um that was a special make. So I'm like, dang, how I got all these consoles and stuff, I can't play a CD, right? And then it didn't hit me. The closer I get back to my hardware roots, the more likely I am to find something that can interact with CDs, which is essentially hardware. But people tend to look at the coding of it, right? The idea that you can write anything on a CD as software, but it's not software, it's hardware. Obviously, you can touch it with your hand. Um, So I basically had to go back in the time capsule, dig up a device, and it worked. I didn't even have to find support for it or anything, like download any extra drivers, nothing. I just had to basically pop it in, and the hardware did the rest. And when you see that, you just have to appreciate the hardware for what it is, right? Hardware is essentially a mold, right? A mold that can't be rewritten, that can't be redone, because it is so unique that it will always work, right? And the idea is that no matter how advanced you try to make games, hardware will always be the fastest video game processor, right? We tend to look at software as a determiner of how advanced a technology is, but in reality, you know, it bridges the gap, but in reality, things only get done through hardware, right? By definition, if you remove the hardware, there will be no software, right? So what you find yourself with is a problem, right? Software I'll tell you, the use of software, right? It is a it's like a it's like a list of rules, right? And the reason why it's a list of rules is anything that you don't list, right, can't be done. Hardware on the other hand is a more or less a ruler, right? And this ruler measures how how far your software can take you, which is why industries always find themselves upgrading hardware more or less, and then the software follows. The problem then becomes, once you realize you can do a lot more with software, do you keep upgrading your hardware, or do you find yourself basically reusing your old hardware, right? And the idea is that you have to first assess when your hardware is no longer feasible before you keep hitting the industry up for new manufacturing. Now, this may sound like I'm basically encouraging companies to sell you basically piss poor equipment, but I'm like, you can't really call it piss poor equipment until it proves it's piss poor equipment. You know what I mean? It's like the hammer, right? The hammer it's an old tool. It's a terribly old tool. It's probably been around longer than any other tool, and yet it still finds use today, right? It's probably more useful as a construction tool than most construction tools today, because the simple fact is the hammer will always revolve around a simple premise, right? The idea that, if I use force on something and I do it right, it'll stay. If I don't do it right, it won't stay. And in any type of construction process, that's important, right? The idea that you want something to not be wiggly, right? You wouldn't want to see if you went to New York and you saw a building wiggle, that would make you feel it would make me feel uncomfortable. You know what I mean? Um, but yeah, that's just how I feel about that. Um, and to bring it back to technology, hardware is that hammer, right? It will always make technology. It will always make software work, right? The question is, when does software make the hammer not work anymore? When does simply being in place no longer become feasible, right? And I feel like it's becoming more or less a problem with this whole idea of virtual reality, right? The idea that you should be able to interact with things on a higher level in terms of display and stuff, but I'm like, you'll keep that. I would be more or less impressed with a if software got less bulky and more simplified, right? And the reason is this: people will always be limited by technology as far as technology is limiting itself, right? Meaning, if it takes a lot to explain, then that's not really an advancement, right? But if you are able to simplify a process to its bare components, then that always works. The problem is, the more you go, the more you try to detail a simple process, the harder you have to explain it, right? And to put that into perspective, anybody who's ever tried to develop for a smartphone, right? There's always been the problem of, even if the companies, right, which endorse this stuff, they will give you the studios for it, right, the software for it, right? The problem is they're not really doing you any favors by giving you code which is simplified, because the idea is this: their ability to simplify it for you just shows that they are already leagues ahead of you, right? Even if you learned how to master using a simple code, you are still leagues behind them, because if they told you to make your own code, you would be at a loss, right? Because you've gotten so used to using the simplified version, then you will find yourself, at a loss. Like you'll be like, but I only know how to click and drag. I only know how to press the button. I only know how to, you know what I mean? So, that's just a fact of the, not a fact of them, a example that, um, what then happens is that, the actual foundation process will always be a secret, right? And the reason why it will always be a secret is because that is a relationship, right? That you have to figure out on your own. How far back do I have to go in terms of computers in order to get to that platform computer, right? That computer which allow all other computers to exist today, right? And I feel like that's a rite of passage for any computer enthusiast. You have to um essentially redo the personal computer, right? And it's not a sense of writing your own system, it's a sense of getting back to a rewritable system. That's all. And the reason why you want to do that is because that's your simplification. When you using a system that is essentially bare bones, right? And bare bones is a good word for it because it's basically saying if you were to write an operating system, this is the minimum amount of code that you would need in order to get a system up and running, and yada yada yada. And I feel like a lot of people wouldn't be prepared for that because that's a struggle within itself. Because when you're talking about um walking around in ground that you are unfamiliar with, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to get stuck, and you're obligated to not tell people what you're doing because they won't be able to relate anyway. You don't go outside and be like, "Hey man, I got these couple of lines of assembly I'm trying to fix. You can help me out." People won't be like, "What the hell are you talking about?" You know what I mean? So there's that. Um, um, um. More importantly, though, the easy software. Ironically enough, is the easy street, right? The idea that once you learn a language, you're in, right? But when you find out that a language is only a means to an end, then you find yourself at a loss because, you know, people tend to think that there is a universal language. And, in a certain degree, there is. C is that universal language, right? That language that all computers can understand. And yet, C can only take you so far because it has to work with other languages. Like, I don't even think people would understand C in relation to .NET framework, right? Or understand C in relation to Linux. Understand C in relation to freaking Apple. Understand C, like you would think that on a basic level you learn C in relation to Windows, right? And then you work your way out. But it's never that simple because um C is more or less a general language, right? It's basically assuming that you are planning on writing on a console, on a command console level, right? Basically interacting with operating systems, but operating systems are layered as to how they are built, meaning that C will only take you as far as operating system commands go. When you're talking about networking, the networking could be written in Java. You know what I mean? Like just terrible, just anywhere. And that's just a couple of examples. Um 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 you know when you think about old languages like Fortran, right? Pascal, something like that, right? These origin coding languages, then you're getting closer to the source, right? Because the idea is that all languages stem from a source understanding of software, right? And it all makes sense because a source code by definition is not the framework, the blueprint for the program, right? And once you get to the blueprint, now you're getting somewhere. So you will then find yourself, just going through code, trying to figure out when am I going to find the source? When am I going to find the source? And I feel like that's just going to be that's on a general awareness thing. That's going to be too much. Nobody's going to want to bother with that because if you just spend 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 hours trying to figure out basic OS, right? And then somebody say, "Give me the answers," you would probably feel pretty pissed, right? You would feel insulted, like, no, what the hell? Why would I give you the answers and I just busted my booty trying to, figure this out? You know what I mean? So, there's that. Also, there's always the lucrative end, right? The point where you get to once you start to crack gold. You get it, gold semiconductors. Once you start to crack gold, right? You basically are dealing with a cash cow, right? You have access to knowledge that will only benefit you and make you a more a more promotable person to other people, right? Because you then have a skill that most people won't work for. Anybody will take the skills for free, and that's how you get into these property battles, right? Over intellectual property. You get these movies like The Social Network, or Steve Jobs movie. I'm still waiting for a Bill Gates movie. I think they made one, but I'm not sure. I haven't really been keeping it up with it. And basically, what happens then is that you find yourself very possessive of your accomplishment, right? And you have a right to. I feel like that's what made the computer a hobby, a true hobby, right? The idea that once you get to the root, you feel a sort of bond with your computer, right? You feel like, this is my baby, like this is my this is my child, you know what I mean? So, you're once you crack software, then hardware makes all too much sense, right? And the reason why it makes all too much sense is because then it becomes, instead of hardware just looking like a road, it looks more like a means to an end, right? You've already cracked the ends with the software. Now you just have to finish it off with the hardware. Then hardware becomes simplified. Now I know, you know, what's affecting my processing power. How does my computer think on a physics level, right? The idea that, um is my computer even processing at a maximum efficiency, right? Is your computer uh is your computer allocating memory or reading memory at an efficient level? Or can you redo this equation and make it so that the memory to processing relationship is more or less instantaneous, which is, I feel like, a harder thing to think about, a harder thing to accomplish than most people will admit, because the idea is that Of course, it's instantaneous. It's running on. It's not instantaneous because the computer has to be built in pieces, right? And as such, those separations are the structural weakness of the computer, right? The idea that a desktop will always be a excessive design compared to a laptop. A laptop will always be a bulky design compared to a smartphone, and a smartphone will always be a minimal design compared to the rest. You know what I mean? Like it all becomes an efficiency thing, right? Um, and what you then get is a concept of hardware that will change depending on your needs, right? Like for example, I feel like if you are trying to run I talked about servers before. If you are trying to run a server, then you can't say, "Oh, I want a minimalistic design," because by definition, you're talking about equipment which has to process for X amount of people. So trying to say that less is more is more or less a ineffectual approach. On the other hand, if you're just trying to run a website, excuse me, then you don't really need to worry about more. You need to worry about how much effort do you need to do on your end in order to maintain your site. You know what I mean? Do you really need to build a server, or can you just pay somebody to run a server for you? And then you do most of the software on your own, right? The actual web page stuff and yada yada yada. You know what I mean? It becomes a different type of thinking. And going back to the software versus hardware relationship, I feel like hardware will always be king because on if you look at hardware on its own, hardware will always be it's always faster than software, right? Because it's the difference between a push of a button versus a code that relies on other code, right? Because you got to take in consideration if you have a page, right, a web page that has extensions on it, right, such as a couple of buttons here or a jump here or a video player or a any type of code that requires interaction from the other end in order to run, that's automatically limited because by definition, code that relies on other code will always be slow, right? Whereas when you think about turning a computer on, it's instantaneous, right? You press a button and everything is already running, right? And the reason why everything is already running is because by definition, on and off on a hardware scale, right, is a essentially the that's the fastest software that you can have, right, on and off. Um, you know, and that's how hardware basically works, right? The idea that you essentially want to get all of your computer's essential code to hardware, right? Versus depending on software. It's like the on-screen keyboard versus the actual keyboard. The keyboard, the on-screen keyboard may be more complicated because it runs on software that is essentially next gen, but the physical keyboard will always be faster because you turn your computer on and it's already able to interact with the system. The what you call a keyboard, the on-screen keyboard is a piece of software that has to be accessed through memory. And as such, it's still waiting. By the time you use hardware and turn the computer on, a integrated keyboard is already on, right? Even USB keyboards are slower than laptop keyboards because the laptop keyboard is like I said, it's integrated with the processing unit. A USB keyboard is more or less a software extension, right? A software to hardware extension, because the port itself, right? The actual USB port has to be software programmed, right? You have to tell the computer, hey, you have additional resources, and then the computer says, oh, okay. And then, after that, you can the hardware does the rest, but essentially, integrating software and hardware is the name of the game, right? Um uh and what you then get is a not really a problem, but an equation, right? How much software do I need to turn into hardware before I will have a minimalistic software? A Essentially, the future needs to get back to the past, right? And how it needs to get back to the past is that the OS needs to just be the OS, right? You That's the problem nowadays. The OS is doing too many people's jobs, right? It's it's functioning because if you use a USB keyboard, it has to be a keyboard. If you use a USB mouse, it has to be a mouse. If you use a touchscreen phone, right, then it has to be a touchscreen. You know what I mean? It's doing too many people's jobs, right? And then people wonder why their phones are so piss poor in quality, because your phone is doing too much. It's already overtaxed, and you just got it, right? So, going back to what I was talking about with the memory thing, right? Not today. The other day, I forgot what day, but I talked about this. Basically the idea is that the computer not only has to remember what it has to do, it then has to remember what you want it to do, right? And then what you want to do on your daily basis, right? And this is how the computer gets overtaxed. It's doing too much, and then what it gets used to doing becomes too much, right? So you find yourself, it starts with memory, right? But in reality, you're counting on performance, right? The idea that if your computer at any time was coded correctly, right? Then if you need a mouse, it should already be accessible within the system, right? So the idea is that the touch screen isn't really the best option, because the idea is that you have to build a bridge between the screen and the circuit board. Something the I the touchpad was a good idea, but I feel like it was for the wrong device. The touchpad should have been on a cell phone, right? And the reason why it should have been on a cell phone is because the moment the cell phone turns on, the touchpad is already on, right? You're no longer having to worry about coding for identifying the mouse as a port versus as a unit extension. There's a difference between a port extension and a processing unit extension. A processing unit extension is connected to the processing unit. So meaning the port, there is no port per se, but to keep analogies all linear, the port is on and off, right? Meaning the computer doesn't look at a port extension as a piece of software. It looks at it as a piece of hardware, always checking to see is it on or off. Um, whereas the port will always be susceptible to that software problem, meaning that somebody could essentially turn off all your ports, right, and essentially make your desktop useless. um, and that's just a problem of software, right? Now, the problem. So hardware isn't perfect. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to sound like hardware has all the answers, because the smartphone, the computer phone has taught us that a computer can be tricked, right? It can be tricked. And how it can be tricked is basically, by making a OS that has to do everything, because that's the only reason why the smartphone works. It has to do everything. Now your smartphone is more or less a software voodoo doll, right? And the reason why it's a software voodoo doll is because basically, if somebody wants to turn off your phone remotely, it can be done. If somebody wants to make your at any time your commands cannot work anymore, right? Your keyboard cannot work, whether it's on screen or physical. It's probably be harder to do if it was on if it was a physical keyboard. The slide phones, those were cool. Um, but once you have a touch screen keyboard, it's no longer you know within your control. Everything gets thrown into a software loop, right? The idea that all it takes is a little additional software, and your computer can basically be told what to do. Um, and this is just a problem, right? The idea that hardware can be controlled by software, a computer can be told to turn off when it clearly wasn't turned. Like, it clearly has a manual override, right? You can clearly turn your phone on and off, but the fact that it has that additional extension because of the need the software dependency, then so what you get basically is a bad habit, right? The idea of software lording over hardware, right? And the reason why that's a bad habit is because basically, at any time, a piece on your hardware board can stop working, right? And you know, it may not necessarily be not working because of a hardware malfunction, but because you're already linked to software, you find yourself in a area of doubt, right? And I'm only detailing you this because this is what happened to me, right? My smartphone played dead at one point, right? And I say it played dead because it did something very weird. It basically ignored all of logic, right? So basically, what happened is at one point or another, my phone just stopped working altogether. It stopped charging. It stopped turning on and off. Like usually when your phone dies of a hardware malfunction, right? Such as your battery running out of juice, you can at least turn your phone on, and then it'll have just enough juice to say, "I don't have no juice," and then turn off again. Um, what this did defied all logic. My phone, it went black. I tried to turn it on and off, didn't work. Took the battery out, tried to put it back in, didn't work. Tried to charge it, didn't work. All my hardware overrides were essentially being ignored, right? And for the most part, I was worried about it. I mean, when hardware is no longer able to control your computer, you should be worried about what you're buying, right? And what happened then was that I had to just abandon it, right? And once I abandoned it, and it got to a point where um, hardware ended up carrying through for it eventually, right? Because I didn't even think this was possible, but you know, when you are able to software program battery life, right? Whereas you essentially tell your computer it has less battery life than it actually does, then you find your computer basically being a voodoo doll. Somebody basically able to I hope nobody does this, but somebody can essentially tell your smartphone, it doesn't need to work anymore, and it'll listen. So the only way your phone will be able to turn back on is when your phone has to realize that its hardware resources have been lying to it, right? No, it's been lying to its hardware resources, which is what happened to me. When my phone finally did reach a red, almost no juice bar, whatever that hardware, that software, animation, whatever you want to call it is, then it came back to me. It woke up from a coma and said, "Hey, I'm hungry." And I said, "Baby, I know you hungry." And I was rejoiced. I rejoiced because I was I almost gave up on my smartphone. I thought it was over. I thought it had reached, because it's an old smartphone. I've had this smartphone for years and years and years. So I essentially I almost gave up on it, right? And it's funny that even though I could not hardware override it, the hardware ended up being the saving grace of it anyway. Because what happened then was that the phone itself couldn't lie, the software couldn't lie anymore, because it had to admit that it depends on hardware resources sooner or later, right? And that hardware resource that it had to depend on was the electrical charge. And you can lie as long as you have an electrical charge, but I'm like, you're gonna end up getting caught sooner or later. And that's what happened. So this is why I am a proponent of hardware superior technology, because anything that doesn't have manual overrides is useless to me. I will never be a proponent of a completely digital era, right? A completely software dominated era. Even though I pay homage to uh the Windows gods, I am still a independent thinking human being, and as such, I will keep my physical limitations always in mind as a safeguard, right? It's more of a nature thing, right? The idea that nature always has safeguards in place in order to keep everything balanced, and I feel like that was what hardware was for, right? In order to keep the computer a balanced device, you need to have hardware dependencies, right? And I feel like trying to software code everything is not the answer, especially when you're talking about battery life, because as my story should have essentially explained to you, software can make mistakes, right? And in this case, the mistake was basically telling my phone that it had less battery life than it actually did, which ended up almost making me think my phone had kicked the bucket. Um, Now I could have done a couple of overrides. Actually, I could have changed my battery. I could have brought a new battery. Actually, I could have changed the charging port. I could have essentially I could have juiced it, right? If you know a little uh 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 electrical stuff, you probably thought of the idea of when somebody's car battery dies and they say they need a jolt, you could have the same process applies to electronics. You can jolt them alive for the quick, like an ambulance, like 1 2 3, 1 2, like you know what I mean. And given the fact that the device is low voltage anyway, that wouldn't have been much of a problem. Uh, 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 Essentially, given the fact that as long as it has hardware dependencies, it will always be accessible as it will always be susceptible to hardware override. But as you know, hardware override requires a in-person you know in-person procedure, meaning that that's just the safe way of doing things, right? The only problem then is that since software does not understand a hardware override, you are at risk of losing data, or you are at risk of damaging software hardware. relationship parts, right? So there's that. You should always use hardware overrides as a in case of emergency thing. Like, most people tend to think of hardware combinations as an override. It's not an override. That's software. The only true hardware overrides are off and on. If your computer is not turning off, you force it to turn off. If your computer is not turning on, you force it to turn on. And these are the truths of the software hardware era, right? The idea that when a computer is on, it's on. When a computer is off, you have to make sure that it's off. I feel like these two things will always be the forefathers of technology, right? On and off. I'll go into that later. Final notes on software and hardware is that understand we are in a software dominated era. And the reason why we're on a software dominated era is because the app, the internet, the the physical shop is going out of business, right? The idea that hardware is only as useful as it is able to be sold as a new product, right? Versus as a reoccurring product. And what that means is that you will only be able to keep businesses around as far as they are able to shelf newer and newer manufacturing. Storing of the old manufacturing became obsolete because the old manufacturing relied more or less on it was basically a hardware industry back in the day, right? You got the blockbusters, you got the EA games, all of these guys that sold basically hardware, right? And what happens then is that once people get accustomed to the software era, you find that they are more or less inconvenienced by carrying soft hardware around. Excuse me. And what this transcends into then is a premature digital era because I feel like hardware will always win, right? Because the software design is so limited by its hardware limitation, not by its hardware dependencies, that you have to focus, you have to keep hardware in mind. Nobody can ever sell you hardware that doesn't factor in. And as such, you should always be wary of when hardware is neglected, right? Because people tend to look at software as the problem, right? Oh, he didn't write the program correctly, or the program has glitches, or yada yada yada. Never ever taken in consideration that the program may not have glitches. Your computer may just not be able to run it, right? Or you don't have the right equipment for the job, right? Because a lot of times software tends to um be more or less an aesthetic, right? A focus on things that don't really determine how quality a machine you have. And people get dragged into this, talking about pixels and all this other stuff. And I'm like, you can talk about those things, but at the end of the day, if I don't like what I see, I'm not going to get it. And that was the lesson of hardware, right? That you can easily tell a good machine from a bad machine. And I'll just leave that at that. To my supporters, shout out to Juanita Hooper, Shamia Skinner, Chris Vasquez, my mans at the mall. Shout out to all my anonymous patrons. Um, as you know, our relationship is hardware based. It will never be imaginary. I will never try to appeal to supporters through a purely software approach, because by definition software represents a out of touchness, right, with the environment, as in, you are essentially dealing with a abstract concept, more or less. And for some people that may work, but if you are a true computer enthusiast, then you already know that the world was built off of computer boards, circuit boards, and the like. And if you don't understand that, then you don't need to understand it all. And with that said, stay tech savvy and have a good day.